Hey class, it's Professor Streeter. This is part 2 of the video on the good life for week 2. Let me return to where we were in the slideshow with this slide. And this has been our question, the ethical question. Not just what do we want, what do we value, but what is the ultimate or the highest good that we seek in life? Philosophers tend to think that we have a way of answering this question. You might think that there is no ultimate or highest good. That's where you could end up with this in this conversation. But the search for meaning, the search for value in life is in some ways the search for the highest or the ultimate good. So the most common answer to this kind of question is that X, some activity or something, in this case running, remember from the previous video, the example of running, the activity of running, is pleasurable, right? That's what makes it good, or that it contributes in some way to happiness, where happiness or pleasure is supposed to be what makes life better all by itself, right? So that pleasure or happiness is the highest or ultimate good that we're seeking. And this explains the desirability of running. It's a means or a part of the achievement of happiness or pleasure. So this is the idea we've come to then, that running or anything that you desire is a happy way of being in the world, or an enjoyable or pleasurable way of being in the world. So this could mean two things: that running or whatever it is that you desire is desired as a means, instrumentally, a means of achieving happiness, an instrument to happiness, a tool for becoming happy. Or it could mean that running has become part of the person's conception or idea of what it means to be happy. So that's the runner who desires running intrinsically for its own sake. The desire for running is a desire for happiness because running has become part of the happy life for that person. Okay, so Mill says something interesting about money, or the desire for money, on page 17 of the hedonism reading, where for many people the instrumentally valuable desire for money, or the desire for money as an instrumental good, gets replaced as a desire for money as an intrinsic good. And he thinks this is a kind of mistake, that people forget that money is valued for what it brings, not for its own sake. But over time, the more you desire money, the more you make the mistake of treating it as an intrinsic good, where your definition of what it means to be happy becomes having more money. Mill thinks that's a mistake, right? But that's an example of what it looks like where something that a person desires becomes part of their idea or the conception of what it means to be happy. Okay, so let's move on to the next slide. So now we've got basically the hedonist idea. I'm sort of leading us up here. Right? According to the hedonist, the value of running or making money or anything else that is genuinely desirable can be explained in either one of two ways. Either it is valued as a means to happiness, so it has instrumental value, or it is valued as a form or part of happiness. It has intrinsic value. And that's just the view that Mill adopts. It's also there in Epicurus, or the germ of the idea is there in Epicurus. It's a hedonistic idea that if something has value for us, then it's desirable either as a means to promoting happiness or as a form or a component of happiness. And so this is what it means to say that happiness or pleasure is the ultimate or the highest good. Not that it's the only good, but that everything else we consider good derives its value or its desirability from the basic value of happiness. Okay, so that's the idea. That's the basic thesis, and that I started with in the first part of the video, and we've gotten to it by thinking about this question of what makes something desirable and good. So both Epicurus and Mill defend this kind of idea, that happiness is the only thing that has intrinsic value, not the only thing that has value, but the only thing that has intrinsic value, and that everything else, right, that is worth pursuing is a means to or a part of happiness. Epicurus and Mill also refine that thesis by defining happiness in relation to pleasure and pain. So for Mill and Epicurus, Happiness is understood in terms of something more basic, right? The desire for pleasure and the avoidance of pain. So now we get the view that well-being, the good, a good life, right? A good life for a human being consists in a life of pleasure, free from unnecessary pain. And pleasure and freedom from pain then are the only things worth desiring for their own sake, the only things that make our lives intrinsically better. And here we can think of pain mentally and physically, emotional pain, mental pain, physical pain. It's the only thing that makes our lives worse intrinsically. So the only way you can really harm someone, according to the hedonist, or make their life worse, is by causing them mental or physical pain of some kind. And the only way you can make a person's life better is either by freeing them from pain of some type or opening them up to more high quality experiences of pleasure. So that's the hedonistic idea. It's important to distinguish between types of pleasure, and that we see that in Schaefer-Landau in chapter 1, right? The distinction between physical pleasure and attitudinal pleasure. The hedonist is defending a view about attitudinal pleasure. The only thing all by itself that makes your life better is the positive attitude of enjoyment of your life, of some activity that you're engaged in, of some object or person in your life, right? Food, right? Just experiencing a momentary feeling is not all by itself something that makes your life better, but enjoying that feeling, enjoying that experience, right? So it's the attitude of enjoyment that the hedonist is latching on to. This is how we measure a person's well-being, right? The more positive their attitude of enjoyment is toward their life as a whole or some part of it, the happier they are. Okay? So think about that distinction and its importance. Epicurus, here are his dates. This is when he lived, and this is a sculpture of him, a bearded Greek philosopher. He founded what was called the Garden School, because much of his time was spent in the garden, and he spent a lot of time with his students gardening and talking about the simple pleasure of gardening. He thought that gardening was a model for how to live well. He lived in Athens, and in this letter that you read to Epicurus, he's defending what he called in his time the 4-part cure to misery. And he thought that the biggest obstacle to happiness was mental anxiety. Fears and desires that we have that get in the way of enjoying our lives. So for him, the starting point on the road to happiness is changing the way you think, changing your beliefs, interestingly, changing your mental attitude. So for example, he thinks that in his time, right, the ancient Greek religion, there are many gods, and he thought that one of the biggest obstacles to happiness for people living in ancient Greece was the way they thought about the gods. And they believed that the gods were vengeful and were going to punish them and could harm them. And he thought this instilled a fear of God that got in the way of people enjoying their lives. So one of the first steps for Epicurus that he thinks about in that letter you read is if what you want is happiness, if you want your life to be good, the first step is forming true beliefs about God and overcoming the fear of God. Related to that is the fear of death. He tries to convince you that death is not something to fear. And so we don't have a reason to fear death. And so if we can see that death is not something to fear, we won't worry about it. And the last two have to do with our desires. We desire lots of things. Many of them are artificial and unnecessary to our well-being. And we have to sort of, over time, come to see that the things that genuinely make our lives good are pretty easy to get. And the things that are hard to get are usually things we don't really need to flourish, to enjoy our lives. So it's a defense of the simple life, right? Simplify your desires, right? Eliminate unnecessary desires. And then secondly, we tend to overly fear pain because he thinks that many pains are actually pretty easy to endure. And so we stress too much about the experience of pain. But most pains don't last very long, and we can move on. So the less we fear pain, the more we'll enjoy life. Okay? So if anything, right, Epicurus, in defending the life of pleasure, is defending a simple life where we don't desire very many things. and we can live simply without fear and anxiety. Okay, so think about that. Here's his letter where he sort of defends that idea. We must also reflect that of desires some are natural, and he goes on. So there he's making the point. That's the quotation that's relevant to what I was just saying. So think about that quotation in the slideshow. So in the end, Epicurus has this idea about hedonism. About the good life. The hedonistic idea of the good life. It's a view about what happiness is. A happy life is a life of inner tranquility in which we don't desire very much and we don't have mental anxiety. Right? That's what it means to enjoy your life, to enjoy attitudinal pleasure. Okay, so I've gone through that a little bit already. Mill then in the 1800s, here's a picture of Mill with his wife, who was very influential as well, and they wrote together many writings on liberty, and Harriet Taylor, was a co-author of a book that they wrote called The Subjection of Women. So Mill was a big critic of the institution of marriage in England at the time, and a defender of the rights of women, and he and his wife wrote a lot of political philosophy. He also wrote this book called Utilitarianism, in which he defends a hedonistic idea about what makes life good. And so Mill is developing Epicurus' idea about happiness. A happy life is the good life. That's what we're seeking. What kinds of lives do we enjoy most? Right? He's thinking that idea through. And so here are some elements of the happy life, the good that we're seeking, happiness, that Mill defends, right? In various ways. He tries to show that a more active, engaged life is a more pleasurable one. We enjoy it more. In order to enjoy our lives, we have to fully develop our capacities. Our physical capacities, our mental capacities, our emotional capacities. So a happy life is one that depends on a certain, having the resources to develop your full potential as a human being. He thinks that we desire many pleasures, but not only what he calls the lower pleasures. Happiness is not just about desiring food and sex. It's also about having desires to be more creative, right? Intellectual and artistic pleasures. And we need both. And then a happy life is not one without pain, but pain is a necessary part of life. But there's lots of pains that are unnecessary. So to enjoy your life, you have to find ways of minimizing unnecessary pain. And we have to think about ways that society as a whole can minimize unnecessary pain for its citizens. Right? So Mill's hedonistic view has implications for what responsibilities we have to each other as individuals and what responsibilities a state or a government has to its citizens. Right? From his point of view, it has a responsibility to promote more happiness. Well, how do you do that if these are the elements of what makes for a happy life? Okay? Anyway, here's a quote from Mill that's famous. In the end, the hedonist is committed to the idea, not that the life of pleasure is the life of a pig, right? But that the life of pleasure for a human being is hard to achieve, right? It's better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. Think about the implications of that claim. What's he saying there, right? You might think that the hedonistic idea defends the life of the baser pleasures. The highest standard in living is just experiencing the baser pleasures, like the pleasures of food and sex and rock and roll or something. But that's not what Mill or Epicurus are defending. Mill's view is that the pleasurable life for a human being involves developing your capacities, right? Using your mind well, educating yourself. That's part of what makes life happy for a human being. So you can think that through. Here are some attractions of the view. I'm ending this video quickly. So this is what Schaefer-Landau talks about in chapter 1, and you can work through this. But think about what's attractive and appealing about the view. One is that obviously there are many paths to happiness, so there are many ways to live a good life. It seems like an egalitarian view. It's not elitist. It seems more democratic. It seems to fit with our intuitions, right? That misery seems to lower the quality of a person's life. Happiness raises it. That seems to be what we want for our loved ones. It just seems to fit our intuitions. Okay? But there are some arguments against it, and this is what I talk about in the video that I shared with you today, the arguments against hedonism. So think about what those arguments are, and that's the topic of those videos that I shared with you. Okay, obviously we're shifting to Heathwood's essay too, and so we'll talk about that in another context. Okay, that's all for now.